The rain was an old enemy on the Tanglewood Ranch, but tonight it was an accomplice. It muffled the distant sound of the state highway and washed the tire tracks into meaningless, flowing brown rivers. August Finch, a man built like an old oak stump and twice as stubborn, stood at gate 14, his oilskin coat heavy and his face set in a grim mask that the low beam of his pickup truck did little to soften. He didn't need to check the latch. He didn't need to inspect the cable. Gate 14 was open. Again. This was the 8th time in 3 months, and this time the consequences weren't just a few stray yearlings cooling their heels in the neighbor's freshly laid sod. This time the consequence was named Prometheus. Prometheus was a Red Angus bull, 3 years old, sired by a champion, and worth more than August's fully paid-off tractor. He was the future of Tanglewood's genetics. Now, he was a mangled, massive heap of dark red muscle and splintered bone half a mile down the road, the victim of a semi-truck that, thankfully, had only sustained a blown tire and a deeply traumatized driver. August didn't curse. He didn't shout. He simply felt the raw, cold ache settle in his chest. The kind of crushing weight that only comes from violation, a theft of something irreplaceable born from willful, careless disregard. The transgressors were the Bakers, a family of developers who had bought the massive adjacent tract of land 6 months ago, not to ranch, but to build a luxury ranchette community called the Aspens. They were new money, city-bred, and regarded August's 100-year-old ranch like an overgrown weed patch they had to occasionally drive through to access their site. August secured the gate, a pointless, hollow gesture, and climbed back into the cab of his beat-up Ford. The mud was so thick on his boots he had to slam the door twice. God! August, he muttered to the steering wheel, his voice rough and low. Don't you go where you want to go. He drove not to his house, but across his pasture line, bouncing along the barely visible track until he reached the bright, garish construction lights illuminating the Baker site. The air here smelled of freshly cut pine and diesel, not wet earth and hay. The noise was constant, even at 9 p.m. on a Monday. He found Ryan Baker, the youngest son and the project's on-site manager, arguing with a foreman next to a new, spotless white GMC Denali. Ryan was mid-30s, wearing designer jeans and a clean yellow safety vest that looked utterly ironic. He was holding a thermal mug and radiating impatience. August cut the engine and stepped out. The silence from his truck was a thunderclap against the drone of the construction machinery. Ryan turned, his face shifting from annoyance to a practiced, condescending smile. August didn't recognize the rust bucket. What's going on, buddy? Did you get lost? August walked toward him, the mud sucking at his boots with every step. He stopped 5 feet from Ryan, forcing the younger man to tilt his head back slightly to meet his gaze. The gate, Ryan. Gate 14. You or your crew left it open again. Ryan frowned, immediately defensive. Oh, that thing? Yeah, probably. It's a real pain in the neck, August. We've got concrete trucks coming through there every hour. You ever try to get a Class A driver to stop and mess with a finicky latch in the dark? It's not feasible. I told you, we need a permanent solution, a motorized gate. Or hell, we could pave that whole stretch for you. Just tell us the number. The sheer casualness of the offer, the implication that August's legacy was merely a logistical inconvenience to be bought and fixed, was like a physical blow. Feasible, August echoed, the word tasting like metal. Prometheus wasn't feasible, I guess. Ryan blinked. Who? My bull Ryan. He got out through the gate you didn't close. A semi hit him on the highway an hour ago. He's dead, mangled. I just left him. He was the best bull I've bred in a decade. He was my future stock. The foreman standing nearby shifted uncomfortably. Ryan, however, looked genuinely confused, like August was complaining about a broken toaster. A bull? Geez, August, I'm sorry to hear that. That's rough. But look, man, you can't blame me for a bull getting hit on a highway. That's, an act of God. You've got to keep your livestock secure, right? That's ranching 101. He took a sip of his coffee. How much was he worth? We can talk numbers. We'll cut you a check for replacement cost. We're good neighbors. August stood motionless, his fists hanging loose at his sides. He saw the genuine, terrifying lack of connection in Ryan's eyes. He wasn't seeing a rancher mourning a lost animal and the threat to his livelihood. He was seeing a business expense, a nuisance fee to be paid. Replacement cost, August repeated slowly. I bred him, Ryan. I helped him stand when he was born. Replacement cost doesn't cover 10 years of selective breeding and 3 generations of work. But let's keep it simple. He leaned in, and his voice dropped to a level that forced Ryan to stop smiling. The gate is a boundary. I put it there to protect my herd and the traveling public. You breach that boundary, you owe me. The value of that bull, before you factor in the genetic loss, is $42,000. That's the butcher's bill you just rang up. Ryan nearly choked on his coffee. 42 grand for a cow? You're joking, no way! That's extortion, August. We're talking insurance now if you're trying to pull this. I'll have my attorney look at it. You do that? August said, his eyes now cold and flat, the eyes of a man who had seen too much violence to be threatened by talk. He turned to the foreman. You tell your boss that until that bill is paid in full, this disrespect stops. If that gate is open again, I'm not calling the insurance company. I'm not calling the police. I'll handle it myself. Ryan scoffed behind him. Oh, big talk, August. What are you going to do? Shoot us? You'll be lucky if we don't sue you for harassment. August didn't look back. He just got into his truck, started the engine, and pulled a U-turn that sprayed a plume of mud and water over the spotless Denali. He didn't race away. He drove slowly, deliberately, leaving Ryan Baker in his wake, sputtering and wiping the mud off his designer jacket. The next morning, August was in the office of Sheriff Frank Healy. Frank was 2 decades younger than August, and August had been the one to sign his acceptance papers into the academy. Now Frank sat behind the mahogany desk looking tired and uncomfortable. I'm sorry about Prometheus, August. Truly sorry, Frank said, rubbing his temple. But you know the drill here. The gate is on your private property. They didn't technically trespass if they used the easement, and they didn't maliciously damage the gate. Leaving it open, repeatedly? That's negligent, sure, but it's a civil tort. Not a criminal matter? Negligent homicide of livestock, August argued, leaning forward, hands planted on Frank's desk. It doesn't exist, August. Not here. And you know the Bakers have that hotshot lawyer, Thompson. He's already spinning this as an inadequate fence line on your part. He'll bury you in discovery. Frank sighed. Look, I can send a deputy by, write up a formal warning about respecting property lines, but that's all I got, buddy. You want 42 grand? You gotta go to small claims. August pushed himself back, the chair legs scraping on the linoleum. The legal system, the one he had spent 30 years upholding, was a clogged, bureaucratic dam that couldn't be breached by a simple moral imperative. The message was clear. The law will not protect your boundary from careless disrespect. And if I lock it with a chain and a padlock, Frank? And they cut the lock? Frank hesitated. Then it's malicious mischief. A misdemeanor, but cutting a lock is easier to defend than chasing negligence. You put a chain on it, they'll call me for blocking their access to their own land. You see the headache? I see it, August said, his voice flat. He looked at the younger man, sensing the fear of complexity and the lack of backbone that had crept into law enforcement. You've gotten soft, Frank. Frank just looked down at his desk. No, August, I've gotten realistic. You should, too. Don't do anything stupid. August didn't go home. He drove straight out to gate 14. The sun was hot now, burning off the morning mist, and the gate looked utterly pathetic, a standard tubular steel design meant to keep honest people honest. He got out his tools, not the hammer or the fence pliers, but a long, heavy length of chain and a massive, hardened steel padlock. He stared at it. The solution that Frank had said was legal but futile. He imagined the satisfying sound of the lock clicking shut, followed by the inevitable sound of Ryan Baker's crew grinding it open with a cordless angle grinder, tossing the mangled pieces into the ditch, and feeling nothing but a faint irritation. The frustration became a physical thing, a tremor in his hands. He wanted justice. He wanted to look Ryan Baker in the eye and make him understand the weight of a $42,000 mistake. He wanted respect. And the only way to get it, he realized, was to build a cost for that disrespect that was far, far higher than any civil penalty. He walked past the gate, following the tire tracks of the Baker construction vehicles onto his own land. The ground was scarred. His pasture grass, the life of his cattle, was rutted into deep, parallel trenches. They had been driving heavy equipment off the easement and straight through his field to save 10 minutes. They hadn't just been careless. They were actively damaging his livelihood for their convenience. August walked back to the gate. He unlocked his toolbox, but he didn't grab a fence stretcher. He reached deep and pulled out a worn, leather-bound notebook, his wife Sarah's journal. She was a master cabinet maker. August spent the next 36 hours in the kind of hyper-focused solitude that had always defined his late wife, Sarah. The shop, smelling of oiled metal and freshly cut walnut, was his sanctuary. His movements were precise, quiet, and utterly divorced from the emotional heat of the confrontation with Ryan Baker. The $42,000 was the catalyst, but the true stakes were intellectual. Could he create a mechanism of consequence so perfectly logical and non-violent that it would force the arrogant respect the law could not enforce? He named his creation Equitas, justice. Equitas was mounted on the cedar post closest to the construction road. It was a sturdy box, roughly the size of a microwave, crafted from dark, lacquered walnut and reinforced with polished brass corner guards. It looked less like a gate mechanism and more like a high-end antique barometer. The actual physical barrier was deliberately trivial. A lightweight, aluminum chain and a simple brass hook easily flicked aside. The deterrent was cognitive, not physical. On the face of Equitas, set deep behind a thick pane of specialized, low-shattering glass, was a custom-made, 3-inch-wide clock face. It had no numbers, only a single, slender, minute hand, the needle of due diligence. Below the clock face was the main interface, a heavy, hand-tooled brass lever, its handle shaped like a stylized shepherd's crook, nestled in a rest position labeled Rest. Above the resting point, etched into the walnut, were 3 simple instructions in elegant script. Commit. Pull lever down to activate. Pass. Open and close chain. Respect. Return lever to rest before needle completes arc. August tested it, timing the cycle with a stopwatch. When the lever was pulled to activate, a faint thwip sound confirmed the release of a spring-loaded internal pneumatic cylinder. Simultaneously, the needle of due diligence began its slow, deliberate sweep across the unmarked glass arc. The full cycle, the journey from activate to the needle hitting the consequence mark, was exactly 180 seconds. 3 minutes, ample time for any vehicle, even a low-geared concrete mixer, to pass through and for the driver to secure the chain and reset the lever. If the lever was not returned to rest within 180 seconds, the internal solenoid triggered. This solenoid did not lock the gate. It did not sound an alarm. Instead, it released a secondary mechanism, a pressurized burst of highly refined, non-toxic, neon green industrial dye into a nearby, pre-positioned, sealed plastic container. This container was attached to the nearest Baker asset, parked off the easement, usually a piece of valuable, non-motorized support equipment or a critical supply cache. The dye was harmless but non-removable without specialized, solvent-based restoration techniques that took hours and cost thousands of dollars per application. It was designed to stain, not destroy. It was the perfect proportional response to carelessness. A visible, expensive, time-consuming penalty for simple, negligent disrespect. At 6:30 a.m., Mike Vance, the Baker foreman, arrived at Gate 14 in his mud-splattered crew cab. Mike was weary, his back aching, and he was already 30 minutes behind schedule thanks to a faulty generator back at the Aspen site. His mood was a short fuse tied to a keg of black powder. He slammed on the brakes, staring at the bizarre new structure. "You've got to be kidding me," he grunted, spitting a stream of coffee onto the ground. The old steel gate was gone. In its place stood the absurdity of August's fine woodworking and brass fittings. Mike saw the lightweight chain and scoffed. He built a birdhouse for a gate. He drove the truck right up to the post. He wasn't stupid. He saw the lever. He even read the instructions out loud, incredulous. Commit, pass, respect. What is this? Some kind of yoga retreat? He reached out and tugged the lever. It moved with a satisfying, expensive resistance. Thwip! He noticed the needle of due diligence begin its sweep. He saw the timer, but his mind instantly rejected the complexity. It's a timer! Probably a notification system. Who cares? Mike pushed the chain aside with his elbow, drove the crew cab through the opening, pulled the chain back into place with the hook, and drove off, leaving the lever firmly in the activate position. He had passed through the physical barrier. Job done, he never looked back. The needle was just past the halfway mark. 180 seconds later, precisely as Mike pulled into the main construction staging area, there was a quiet, internal clack at gate 14. Mike stepped out of his truck, ready to yell at the lazy night shift crew, but his attention was immediately drawn to a corner of the staging area where a brand new, highly expensive, specialized GPS surveying drone, waiting for its morning launch, was slowly being engulfed in a cloud of brilliant, eye-watering neon green mist. The drone, the $18,000 piece of mapping technology that Ryan had bragged about, was not broken. Its rotor blades still spun, its lenses were intact, but it was now entirely, flawlessly coated in a non-removable, vivid layer of dye. It was now functionally useless for surveying a $18,000 neon paperweight. Mike's jaw dropped. He ran over, touching the substance gingerly. It was a slick, inert film. It wasn't corrosive. It was just there. The confrontation came 20 minutes later. Ryan Baker, wearing a frantic purple flush under his collar, was speeding toward Gate 14 in his Denali, Mike nervously riding shotgun. Ryan had already been on the phone with the drone supplier, who had informed him that the repair, involving a complete optical strip-down and recalibration, was 3 days minimum and cost $5,000 plus the replacement of all external plastic housing. They found August near the gate, leaning against his pickup, sipping coffee and watching his cattle graze. He looked peaceful, almost bored. Ryan screeched to a halt and jumped out, throwing his thermal mug to the ground. You crazy old psycho! What in God's name did you do? You vandalized my property. That's felony damage. August took a slow sip of coffee. Good morning, Ryan. Pleasant weather. Don't you give me pleasant weather. My drone. It's covered in slime! It's ruined! $5,000 and 3 days down. I'm calling the sheriff, August. You are going to jail. August finished his coffee and placed the mug carefully on his tailgate. He walked over to Aquitas. You're welcome to call Frank, August said calmly. But let's look at the facts. Your drone was parked on my property line, slightly inside the easement boundary, where I am legally allowed to install safety features. He pointed to the instructions. This device is a safety feature. It does not prevent access. It manages responsibility. He pointed to the lever, which Mike had left in the activate position. Your foreman, Mike, pulled the lever to commit to respecting the process. But he failed to complete the process. He failed to return the lever to rest. He breached the contract of the boundary. Mike sputtered. It's a gimmick. I just pushed a little chain aside. What difference does a lever make? The difference, August stated, his voice firm, is the cost. This device is designed to measure and punish carelessness, not malicious intent. Had you returned the lever, the mechanism would have reset, and the consequence container positioned near your asset would have remained dormant. You chose to save 10 seconds of effort, Mike. The cost for that 10 seconds applied to your employer is now $5,000 and 3 days of lost surveying time. And that is perfectly proportional to the $42,000 I lost due to your prior continued neglect. Ryan grabbed August's arm. This is ridiculous. I'm tearing this whole ridiculous wooden box down right now. You are free to do that, Ryan, August said, his eyes meeting Ryan's with unnerving intensity. But before you apply blunt force to an unknown mechanism of complex engineering, I want you to consider the cost of that choice. This isn't a padlock you can cut and toss aside. This mechanism is built for nonviolent resistance. The faster you destroy it, the more expensive the consequence becomes. Think about how much that $18,000 drone is worth compared to the entire fleet of vehicles sitting on your job site. Ryan dropped his arm, breathing hard. He was used to simple battles, a lawyer's threat, a physical confrontation. This was different. This was logic. This was a game of chess played with construction equipment. He stared at Aquitas, now an object of immense, terrifying mystery. He saw the cedar, the brass, the deliberate precision. He suddenly remembered August's late wife, Sarah, the one who had built those impossible clockwork wooden machines. He turned to Mike. "Get the backhoe. We're ripping it out. Now!" "Ryan, wait," Mike said, suddenly cautious. "He's right. What if it's tied into something else?" "I don't care. I'll pay another $5,000. I can't have this lunatic running my site." Ryan ran to his Denali, pulled out a thick, heavy steel tow cable, and began hooking it around the cedar post, his hands shaking with blind rage, the powerful beat, escalating karma shock. As Ryan cinched the cable, August slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, old-fashioned harmonica. He put it to his lips and began playing a slow, mournful, off-key rendition of the Battle Hymn of the Republic. It was loud enough to be heard over the rising wind, but too simple to be a threat. But Ryan was too far gone to notice the music. He jumped back into his truck, slammed the gear shift into drive, and floored the accelerator. The Denali roared, the cable went taut, and nothing happened to the cedar post. Instead, simultaneously across the entire Baker construction site, every single piece of heavy equipment, the bulldozers, the track loaders, the cranes, the dump trucks, and all. Ryan Baker's face was a study in pure, unadulterated humiliation. The Denali's engine idled uselessly as the two men stared, not at the silent $2 million worth of earth-moving equipment, but at the tranquil figure of August Finch, who now leaned casually against his rusty pickup, playing a sad little tune on a cheap harmonica. The effect was maddening. The music, harmless and almost whimsical, was the soundtrack to Ryan's financial meltdown. "What? What do you mean, disengage?" Ryan finally croaked, his voice strained and high-pitched. He felt a desperate need to reclaim authority, but every instinct told him to tread lightly around the old man and his terrifyingly precise walnut box. August lowered the harmonica. "The passive resistance component is triggered by shock or rapid displacement, Ryan. Your attempt at vandalism broke the seal on the acoustic dampening unit inside Aequitas. To stop the jamming, you must reverse the sequence of events. Gently pull the lever back to activate. Hold it for exactly 15 seconds, long enough for the passive emitter to recharge its internal capacitor. Then return it, very slowly, to rest. That will reset the field and allow your equipment to communicate again." Ryan looked at Mike. Mike looked terrified. They were being dictated terms by a rancher standing in the mud. "And what's the price?" Ryan asked, bitterness thick in his throat. "The butcher's bill for Prometheus was $42,000, Ryan," August said, his tone utterly businesslike, like a machine calculating interest. "Your drone expense, $5,000. The downtime for the construction site, due to the intentional triggering of the secondary system, will be billed hourly at the peak utilization rate for your combined fleet. That's $57,000 a day in lost revenue plus your payroll. We'll calculate the exact charge when the jamming stops. And, of course, you will be paying for the necessary replacement of the acoustic component within Aequitas. $200 for parts and labor." August picked up his coffee mug. "You may now proceed with the restart sequence. But I suggest you move fast. The meter is running." The next 20 minutes were agonizing. Ryan, stripped of his pride, his clothes stained with mud from the useless tow cable maneuver, followed August's instructions with agonizing care. He pulled the lever to activate, watched the needle of due diligence begin its sweep, and held it for the specified time, sweat dripping from his brow. When he finally, tenderly, guided the lever back to rest, there was a barely audible click from the box. Within seconds, the silent construction site roared back to life. Engines choked, sputtered, and settled into a heavy diesel rhythm. The main tower crane, which had been frozen mid-swing, finished its arc. The sound was deafening, a sudden transition from tomb-like silence to industrial chaos. Ryan stared at August, hatred warring with a dawning fear. August had just demonstrated that he controlled the economic lifeblood of the entire Aspens project, using nothing more than a piece of finely crafted joinery and a clever, borderline legal application of physics. The response from the Baker corporate headquarters was swift and severe. By 2:00 p.m., a black stretch Mercedes-Benz pulled up to Gate 14. Out stepped Robert Baker, Ryan's father and the CEO of Baker Development, a man whose tailored suit looked alien against the rugged landscape. With him was Lionel Thorson, the high-powered corporate lawyer Frank Healy had warned August about. Slick, predatory, and carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than August's truck. The two men surveyed Equitas as if it were a piece of alien technology. "This is unconscionable, Finch," Robert Baker declared, his voice a trained corporate boom, cold and authoritative. Robert had the smooth, untouched skin of a man who dealt exclusively in air-conditioned boardrooms, a sharp contrast to August's weathered hide. August was ready. He had anticipated the legal artillery. He stood by the post, a simple ledger in his hand. "Mr. Baker," August replied, nodding politely, "I've tallied the bill for the downtime, 2 hours and 7 minutes. Based on the declared hourly utilization rate of your fleet, that comes to $11,954.80. Thorson, the lawyer, stepped forward, opening his briefcase. "Mr. Finch, let's dispense with this playground intimidation. We have filed an immediate restraining order based on the tort of nuisance and intentional interference with contract. Furthermore, your device utilizes electromagnetic frequency jamming, which we believe constitutes the use of a weaponized device without a Federal Communications Commission license, a clear felony." August didn't flinch. "I'm sure you have, Mr. Thorson, but you'll find that the device does not transmit a signal. It simply saturates a narrow band of proprietary frequencies used by Mr. Baker's imported GPS-guided equipment. It's no different than a poorly shielded arc welder. It is a known, if inconvenient, consequence of using that particular technology near certain mechanical actuators. It is a passive resistance component designed only to stop a violent act of destruction against the post itself. The moment your client released the tension, the saturation ceased. I have violated no statute," he held up the bill. "But the fact remains, you owe me $42,000 for the intentional negligence that killed my bull, and $11,954.80 for the damages incurred when your son attempted to destroy my private property. And that die on the drone is costing you $5,000, for a total of $58,954.80. Robert Baker looked at his lawyer, who gave a nearly imperceptible shake of his head. Thorson knew an immediate legal fight was messy, costly, and might require revealing proprietary fleet technology in court. "Fine," Robert spat. "We will pay the full amount under protest, Finch. But this ends now. We require unimpeded access to our site. This thing must go." "The money is for past damages," August corrected him gently. "The mechanism is for future conduct. It stays, but I'm a reasonable man. I've seen the logs of your crews. They need to pass at 5 a.m. and 7 p.m. I will leave the mechanism off during those hours. All other access requires the demonstration of respect. If the lever is not reset, the consequence will be incurred." Robert Baker realized he was dealing with a mind far sharper than his own. August wasn't seeking revenge. He was demanding compliance through economic pressure. Robert cut a check for the full amount on the spot. It was a humiliating surrender, but the construction schedule was everything. That night, the Bakers held an emergency meeting. Ryan was incandescent with rage. "We can't live like this, Dad. He's holding us hostage with a glorified cuckoo clock." "He's holding us accountable, Ryan," Robert countered, calmer now, the sting of the payment having forced clarity. "And we gave him the power. We're not doing this again. No more negligence. We're going to bypass his stupid rule entirely." Thorson presented the plan. "The old man is monitoring his gait. He's watching the time. So we remove the element of time and the element of vehicle identification. We will hire an anonymous third-party contractor, just a single guy in a cheap, unmarked sedan, to enter at 3 a.m. He will drive through the open area and deliberately leave the lever on activate. He will then park deep within the site and wait for the drone's replacement parts to arrive. If the consequence triggers, it will hit a random cheap target, a stack of plywood, a rented generator, and we will claim it was a rogue trespasser. We simply don't use Equitas for a week until we can get a permanent court order forcing its removal." The plan was a cynical, corporate cheat, a way to comply with the letter of the law while violating the spirit of the agreement. August, however, wasn't just watching the time. He was watching human nature. He had spent his life observing livestock and the men who tended them, and he knew that arrogance always seeks the path of least resistance. He knew they would try to game the system with an unmanned entry outside the schedule. 2 days after the check cleared, August was back at Gate 14, working with a small, custom-built device crafted from a piece of old railroad track, a complex array of low-frequency sound emitters, and 2 solar panels. He didn't install it on the gate post. He buried it 50 feet back from the opening, directly under the easement. This mechanism was the third and most critical layer. It wasn't about equipment, dye, or even a timer. This one was about emotional equilibrium. It was designed to target the user's focus and psychological state. He called this layer Nemesis. Nemesis detected the weight and vibration of a passing vehicle. If a vehicle passed through the gate opening when Equitas was in the activate position, confirming the disrespect of the boundary, and the weight of that vehicle was under 3 tons, signaling a light passenger car, not construction traffic, Nemesis triggered a unique consequence. It didn't jam, die, or destroy. It simply began to play. At 3 a.m. on a Friday, the third-party driver, a nervous young man named Jesse, hired by the Bakers for a quick $200, pulled his battered Honda Civic up to Gate 14. He saw the elegant wooden box, felt a shiver of unease, but remembered his instructions. He pulled the brass lever down to activate. Thwip. The needle of due diligence started its sweep. Jesse drove the Honda through the opening, deliberately left the lever in the on position, and sped toward the staging area. He had driven barely 300 feet onto the easement when the silence of the night was shattered by a sound so unexpected, so deeply unnerving, that Jesse slammed on his brakes and stared wildly into his rearview mirror. The powerful beat, psych. Robert Baker stood at Gate 14, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his cashmere coat, staring with cold fury at Jesse's abandoned Honda Civic. The small, dirty car was the final, ridiculous testament to his failure to control the situation. He didn't care about the $200 paid to the kid. He cared that a rancher, a man who still manually split firewood, had outsmarted his high-priced corporate strategy. He didn't use a wiretap. He didn't use a net, he used a ghost, Ryan said, running his hand over the walnut shell of Equitas, treating it now like a live explosive. Jesse said it was Sarah. He said the music came from the ground and it felt like being 8 years old and realizing you broke something you can't fix. It's psychological warfare, Dad. Lionel Thorson, the lawyer, stepped over a patch of dried mud with the fastidious care of a man who rarely touched anything unlaundered. The music component, Nemesis, is ingenious. Technically, it's a localized acoustic feedback loop amplified by seismic vibration plates. It's an immersive sound experience. There's no law against it, especially on his private easement. We can't charge him with harassment without admitting we attempted to circumvent a civil agreement with an anonymous operative. It's a dead end, Robert. We cannot fight him on his own turf. The gate. Robert Baker looked away from the Honda and out across the vast, rolling expanse of Tanglewood Ranch. It was beautiful, irritatingly so. It stretched for thousands of acres, land that should have been theirs years ago. August Finch was an immovable anomaly, a relic of a simpler time, whose stubborn self-reliance had become a deadly obstacle. Then we stopped fighting the fence. Lionel, Robert's voice was dangerously low, a controlled rumble of absolute power. We fight the foundation. We don't need to enter the site through his gate if the site itself is legally infeasible. I want to know where he is vulnerable. Water rights? Zoning? The State Land Trust? Find me the leverage to condemn this land, not by force, but by paperwork. I want him crushed, financially and legally, until he begs me to buy him out. Thorson smiled, the professional predator sensing fresh meat. Now you're thinking like a developer, Robert. I'll start with the Environmental Impact Report from the 2004 State Survey. Finch's property borders the Protected Wetlands Reserve. A ranch of this size and age almost certainly has grandfathered, but highly contestable waste runoff systems. If we can prove the ranch is poisoning the water table leading into the protected area, we can get a complete cease and desist order on his cattle operation and a full environmental injunction. That is an expense he cannot afford to litigate. Within 48 hours, the siege began. August didn't receive a phone call or a complaint. He received a stack of registered mail, a thick packet of legal documents, each one a calculated strike designed to hit him where he lived, outside the perimeter of Equitas. The lead document was a petition for temporary environmental injunction and site inspection, citing alleged noncompliance with effluent regulations and demanding an immediate cessation of all cattle grazing near the wetlands boundary. The stakes had vaulted from a $42,000 bull to the immediate survival of the ranch itself. The grazing land they targeted was a third of August's usable pasture. If the injunction was granted, he would have to sell off a quarter of his herd instantly, collapsing his operating capital and his line of credit. It was the slow, legal stranglehold August had feared from the start. August didn't rush to the phone to call his own lawyer. He didn't pace or curse. He simply went to his library, a small dark room dominated by worn leather books, maps, and his late wife's workshop table. He pulled out Sarah's journal, turning past the schematics for Equitas and Nemesis, past the notes on acoustic dampening and low-frequency emitters. He found the final entry, scribbled in Sarah's elegant, confident hand, under the heading, "The Ultimate Proportionality." It wasn't a mechanism. It was a plan. August and Sarah had always known the value of Tanglewood was not just in the cattle or the land, but in the history, the kind of local, unassailable history that the Bakers, with their imported money, could never possess. Sarah had spent years digitizing, archiving, and cross-referencing every land deed, every county survey, and every boundary dispute dating back to 1890. The key lay in the history of the Perimeter Creek water rights, a contentious issue that had been settled in court in 1912. The original ruling had established a specific, grandfathered easement for Tanglewood to access the water, an easement that ran directly through the land the Bakers had recently acquired. But Sarah's research had found a deeper truth. It wasn't just an easement. For the next 2 days, August worked exclusively on two things: gathering specific, verifiable documentation and building a final, portable, non-violent instrument. This instrument was a small, ornate cedar box, lined with velvet and containing only a highly specialized, antique brass sextant and a newly machined, microscopic brass rod attached to a simple surveyor's level. It was the most delicate piece of engineering yet. When he finished, he knew the environmental injunction, the Bakers' ultimate weapon, was not just useless, but an enormous karmic boomerang. August called Robert Baker's office directly. "Robert, I've received your paperwork. The environmental injunction. I suggest you come to my ranch immediately. Bring Mr. Thorson. We can discuss your legal action before I respond in kind." Robert, smug with the confidence of his pending legal victory, agreed instantly. This was the breakdown he had been waiting for. The meeting took place not at the gate, but at the original crumbling stone foundation of the Tanglewood homestead, deep within the property near the wetlands boundary. August stood there, not in his work clothes, but in a clean denim shirt and pressed khakis, looking like a man ready for court. Robert Baker and Thorson arrived in the black Mercedes. Thorson held the injunction papers like a death warrant. "The game is over, Finch," Robert announced, his voice echoing with finality. "Your little toys are cute, but you can't fight the EPA and state regulators. The contamination is documented. You cease grazing tomorrow or we sue for total asset seizure to fund the cleanup." August didn't argue the point. He simply held out a simple, old ledger book, not the one for the bill, but one containing historical maps. "This land was acquired by the state in 2004 for the protected wetlands, Robert. You based your environmental claims on the boundary established in that survey," August stated calmly. "But you didn't check the 1912 water rights ruling. My family fought hard for those, and we won. Sarah spent years confirming the exact coordinates." August opened his small cedar box and pulled out the brass sextant. He set it down on a nearby rock, adjusted the level, and sighted a fixed point on the horizon, a specific, ancient oak tree that was visible only from this precise location. The boundary set in 2004 was legally flawed. "Thorson," August continued, not looking up from the sextant, "because the 1912 ruling gave Tanglewood a specific, non-negotiable perimeter access corridor, a 50-foot wide, perfectly straight line from this foundation point, running due northwest to the old riverbed. It's an access easement for water, and it's irrevocable. Robert looked utterly perplexed. An easement? So what? A 50-foot path. A 50-foot path that runs due northwest, August repeated, finally looking up, his eyes sharp and focused. Now look at the plat map for the Aspens development, Thorson. Do you know where the exact center of the new community clubhouse, the pool, and the signature main entrance drive are located? Thorson's face, usually impervious, went slack. He pulled out the Baker plat map, his hands shaking slightly. He traced the line with a cold finger, running the coordinates from the old riverbed. The powerful beat, karmic shock, and irony. August walked over to a newly installed bronze plaque that Robert had placed months ago, marking the future site of the Aspens grand entrance. August placed the tip of the tiny brass rod from his cedar box precisely on the center of the plaque. That, Robert, August said, his voice ringing with the authority of decades of stewardship, is the exact center of the 50-foot wide, irrevocable perimeter access corridor granted to Tanglewood Ranch in 1912. Your grand entrance, your signature clubhouse, and the main sewer line connecting to your entire development are built directly on top of my permanent, legally superior right-of-way easement. August pointed to the small, ornate brass sextant. This device is veritas. It doesn't break things. It only reveals truth. And the truth is, the entire foundation of the Aspens development is legally unsound, built on land that is and always will be primarily my access path. You can fight my fence, but you cannot move my history. And until you legally sign over the $42,000 for Prometheus and pay the $58,000 for the costs you've incurred, and publicly withdraw your frivolous environmental claim, I will be exercising my right to use this access corridor. I need to drive the cattle to water. I may need to put a temporary fence up to guide them, right through the middle of your clubhouse parking lot. The silence that followed August's revelation was the most profound sound Robert Baker had ever experienced. It wasn't the silence of his paralyzed construction site. It was the silence of absolute ruin. Lionel Thorson, the corporate lawyer, stared at the bronze plaque marking the Aspens grand entrance, then at the tiny, precise brass rod resting on its center, then back at the historical documents August held, an irrevocable right-of-way easement. Granted in 1912, Thorson whispered, his face the color of wet cement. Mr. Baker, an easement of this nature is virtually unassailable. It predates all current zoning and titles. The entire development, the foundation of the clubhouse, the main entrance drive, the trunk sewer line, it all sits directly on a legally superior access corridor that is not ours. Robert snatched the document, his manicured hands tearing the paper slightly. He searched frantically for the loophole, the error, the typo. But Sarah Finch had been meticulous. The coordinates were confirmed by the antique sextant, Veritas, which August now gently placed back in its velvet-lined box. You built on top of my family's history, Robert, August said, his voice void of triumph, only weary finality. You assumed that because the path wasn't in use, it wasn't protected. You assumed that because you had the money, you owned the right to disregard my boundaries. But the law, when properly researched, is the ultimate nonviolent weapon. You filed an injunction to take my grazing land? I'm here to take your entire entrance. Robert Baker realized that every act of arrogance, from running over Prometheus to attempting to destroy Equitas to launching a legal attack on the ranch's survival, had only fueled August's slow, deliberate counterattack. You can't do this, Robert pleaded, dropping all pretense of corporate bluster. The cost, the delays, the lawsuits from the investors. It will be tens of millions, Finch. It will ruin me. The cost of a bull, Robert, was $42,000, August replied, turning to walk away. The cost of respect is much, much higher. You have until noon tomorrow to respond to my terms. After that, I will be legally moving my cattle along the established, irrevocable perimeter access corridor. I need to get them to water. At 9 a.m. the following morning, the Tanglewood herd, 60 head of prime black Angus led by a large, stoic replacement bull August had quietly acquired, began to move. August, Riding his gelding did not use the main dirt road. He rode directly to the corner of the Baker property, where he and his ranch hand erected temporary, lightweight orange construction fencing that demarcated the 50-foot wide perimeter access corridor according to the coordinates confirmed by Veritas. The cattle were indifferent, following their instincts and August's quiet direction. They walked the straightest path to water. That path led them directly through the freshly paved asphalt main entrance loop, where the new community sign was waiting to be installed. It led them across the freshly laid sod of the future pool courtyard. It led them right past the massive concrete pylons that formed the foundation of the Aspens Community Clubhouse. Chaos erupted. Construction came to a complete, immediate halt. The site manager, frantic, called Robert. "Sir, the cattle are everywhere. We can't move them." Finch is sitting on his horse and says it's his right-of-way. The county inspector is here and he's issuing a formal stop-work order until the easement is resolved. The investors are calling. The sight of the cattle, Prometheus's brethren, indifferently grazing on Robert Baker's 100 per yard imported shrubbery was the ultimate nonviolent assault. It was financial strangulation disguised as a leisurely cattle drive. The final confrontation occurred at 11:30 a.m., half an hour before August's deadline. Robert Baker arrived alone, no lawyer, no son, no Mercedes. He was driving a rental pickup truck, his face drawn and defeated. He found August sitting on the cracked foundation stone, watching his cattle chew on the ornamental landscaping. Robert didn't shout. He just sat on the grass, a ruined man. "Finch, you win. Name your price. I'll cut the check. Just name the dollar amount to sign the easement over. We'll re-engineer the whole development." August pulled a single folded sheet of paper from his pocket. It was not a contract of sale. It was a list of demands for remediation and restoration of respect. "I don't want your development, Robert," August stated. "I want what was taken, and I want a public record of your accountability. Here are the non-negotiable terms for a 99-year renewable lease of the perimeter access corridor. You will never own it, but you may use it, provided you adhere to the following." August read the list. Financial reparation. You will pay the initial $42,000 for the loss of Prometheus, and the $58,954.80 for damages incurred from your disrespect. Payable immediately. Legal restitution. You will publicly, and without qualification, withdraw the environmental injunction. Acknowledging it was based on inaccurate data. Physical compliance. You will personally, Robert, disassemble Equitas and Nemesis and return the components to my workshop. You will learn the effort required to build what you tried to break. Symbolic restoration, the nonviolent answer. You will permanently relinquish all claims to the land currently designated as the main entrance and clubhouse site. You will use a different location for your entrance. The land defined by the perimeter access corridor will be professionally landscaped as a beautiful, dignified, 50-foot wide, permanent public trail and green space. The monument, the massive, bronze-plated sign you prepared for the Aspens Grand entrance, will be installed not at the new entrance, but at the start of the new public trail. But you will replace the development name with a single, clear inscription, Tanglewood Ranch Access Corridor. Est 1912. It will be a permanent monument visible to every resident and visitor, reminding them that this land answers to a higher history than their money. Robert Baker read the list, his face a mask of bitter, defeated acceptance. The monetary costs were high, but the symbolic cost, the permanent, public memorial to his humiliation, was devastating. "You're forcing me to advertise my defeat to my own customers," Robert finally said, his voice hollow. "No," August corrected him. "I'm forcing you to advertise respect to your neighbors, Robert. You will publicly honor the boundary you repeatedly violated." Robert stood up, looked at the majestic, oblivious cattle, and extended a trembling hand. Done. The powerful beat. Final justice and resolution. 6 months later, the Aspens held its grand opening. The new main entrance was functional, if awkwardly situated. The community clubhouse was built on a different section of the land, but the most striking feature of the entire development was the Tanglewood Ranch Access Corridor. It was a 50-foot wide swath of pristine, manicured green space, winding gracefully through the heart of the community. framed by expensive river stones and drought-resistant native grasses. At its head stood the massive bronze plaque that Robert Baker had been forced to install. Near the old, original Gate 14, now a simple, open, restored ranch gate. August Finch stood with his foreman, watching his herd cross the former construction site. Now a peaceful, legally protected trail. Robert Baker, pale and subdued, approached August. He carried a small, elegantly wrapped cedar box. "The final component, August," Robert said quietly, handing over the box. "The last piece of nemesis. I kept the lever for Equitas. I think I need the constant reminder." August took the box. "Thank you, Robert. The herd appreciates the new path to water." As Robert turned to leave, August called out one last time. "Robert, there's one thing you never understood about the consequence mechanisms." Robert paused, dreading a final twist. August smiled. The first true, peaceful smile Robert had seen. The lullaby played by Nemesis, the song that drove your contractor away, that wasn't a recording of Sarah. That was me. It was the only song Sarah ever let me play on her old emitters. It's the sound of a boundary being held, Robert. A nonviolent answer. Robert Baker looked back at the rancher, defeated by integrity and a piece of engineered furniture, and finally understood the true weight of the nonviolent answer. August had never needed to break him. He just needed to force him to build a monument to his own compliance.